Welcome to Chat Cyber, a podcast on all things cyber policy where we explore key issues and discuss policy strategies with industry experts.
Hey, hello and welcome back to another episode of Chat Cyber, Cyber Florida's policy podcast. As always, I'm your host, James Jacobs, Cyber Florida's Associate Director for Policy and Partnerships.
And I am your co-host, Jordan Deiuliis, Cyber Policy Analyst at Cyber Florida.
We want to thank you guys for tuning back in to another episode. We're joined today by the one, the only, the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Bryan Langley of Cyber Florida, our one and only. Bryan leads our critical assessment program. Jordan, would you do us a favor and share a little bit about Bryan's background?
Absolutely. So Bryan was appointed as the Senior Advisor at Cyber Florida to lead and coordinate public and private efforts developing Florida's critical infrastructure risk assessment. Previously, Bryan served as the Senior Vice President of Defense Development at the Indiana Economic Development Corporation. He also served as Executive Director of the Indiana Department of Homeland Security and the Homeland Security Advisor for USDHS, where he oversaw the State Fire Marshal's Office, Emergency Management, State Building Commissioner, and chaired Indiana's School Safety and Cybersecurity Boards. Additionally, Bryan worked in the White House as the U.S. Assistant Chief of Protocol under the George W. Bush administration. Bryan, thank you so much for joining us today to discuss Cyber Florida's Critical Infrastructure Protection Program.
Great. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, James. Good being with you both.
Bryan, as you can tell by his very long list of accomplishments and his resume, is who I want to be when I grow up. Bryan, the first segment that we do is called Explain It to James. So we often talk about concepts on here that aren't familiar to everybody in the audience. And we figure if you can explain it in a way that I can understand it, then the audience can understand it. So if you could start us from the beginning before we jump into some scripted questions and explain a little bit about where the assessment came from, what its goals are, and you can touch maybe a little bit on some preliminary data that we found, and we'll get into that in more detail in the questions.
Yeah, thank you, James. Thank you, Jordan. So we're very fortunate here at Cyber Florida to have great support from the Florida legislature. So back in basically 2022, they allocated a significant amount of funds to conduct a comprehensive risk assessment of all critical infrastructure sectors here in the state of Florida. That's 16 infrastructure sectors identified by DHS and the Florida Department of Emergency Management. That includes both public and private sectors. What's unique about this, and it's not being done nationally, it's not a competition, is that we're actually looking at all 16 sectors. So it's actually like playing golf with all the golf clubs as opposed to one club where you're looking at only one sector. All these sectors are interoperable. They impact one another. So if a school is hit by a cyber attack, then that impacts parents, that impacts students. But if a school also has to deal with water issues, has to deal with electrical issues, has to deal with infrastructure issues, has to deal with transportation, that's a significant challenge for that poor community who's going through this. And so what's been great is the legislature gave us this funding, the resources, and the support to do a risk assessment. And the risk assessment all goes to the state. So we've turned a risk assessment into a full-fledged program. Thanks to your support, the support of the state legislature, General Frank McKenzie, who's our executive director, and Ernie, who's our director, to continue the risk assessment to support. We have close to 700 critical infrastructure sectors participating in the Florida Cyber Risk Assessment, which is wonderful. So you think about the data that we have across all 16 sectors to identify their gaps, their maturity, their vulnerability, their weaknesses, their ransomware readiness. So with all this great data, we have good information to provide the legislature with a lot of details and information that can help them out protect our critical infrastructure sector. So we're very fortunate to continue the program, to continue the research, and at the same time, give them resources that they've given us to give. So the training resources, the cyber range that exists at Cyber Florida, working with our great partners at FLDS and FDEM, Emergency Management. So we take all this information, we provide all these resources, and we get it to these sectors free of charge. And it's a great mission to be a part of.
Absolutely. Now, really quick, Bryan, just for clarification as well, can you explain what is critical infrastructure and why is it so important to secure?
Yeah, critical infrastructure is really the things that you, on a daily basis, to keep things normal. It's your banking, it's your transportation, it's your financing, it's your public safety, it's your education, it's your transportation, it's your nuclear. Everything that you do in your life is dependent upon a critical infrastructure. So if you think about you getting into your car, you're driving somewhere, and then technology goes off, then you lose your ability to communicate. And at that point in time, you lose your ability to be transporting because the lights can go off, and or for instance, you have a situation where your bank line goes down. Then how do you actually get the money you need to pay the bills? So critical infrastructure is everything you do on a normal daily basis and it's identified by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So there's 16 sectors and 54 subsectors, which was very educational for all of us because we had to really define those 16 and what make up the 54. And many individuals who we work with weren't even were aware of what sector they were in because they could either blend between transportation or public safety. So it's a good educational exercise for us to define the 16 sectors.
So, Bryan, you made an interesting point there, and I think it's worth revisiting very quickly. A lot of what we've done, we couldn't have done without the support of the Florida legislature, and we appreciate the confidence they put in Cyber Florida to be able to execute this. And it's given us this giant batch of data, for lack of a better way to explain it, that we're only just now discovering all the many different ways that it can be useful. Now, to put people's mind at ease that might be listening to this in the future within the critical infrastructure networks, when we say batches of data, if you were to complete our assessment, we, Cyber Florida, won't have the privileges of seeing your individual results. We collect the data in the aggregate and send that along to policymakers. But even in that, we found so much value, right? Like you mentioned, we've got value. We're working on resources for those critical infrastructure entities. We've provided value for the policymakers and the regulators. So we've created this ecosystem through this assessment that we're hoping that we'll see the dividends of good policy and the ball being moved forward in the future. The first report that came out of that batch of data was the report that was tasked to us by the legislature in the appropriation back in June of 2023. Can you maybe share a little bit of the highlights of what the findings in that report was that we shared with the legislature?
Yeah, there were several. Let's stand out first with what the training resources that can actually support legislation developed and implemented by the legislature. To ensure that our public safety officials and those who are in the government sector have access to the best training possible, the risk assessment data identified the fact that 49% of those who are participating in the risk assessment, and we're dealing with a lot of different sectors across the state, 49% don't have a learning management system. The unique thing about that is we take the initiative from the Florida legislature to focus on training, work with our SUS partners, work with our friends at the Florida Digital Services, and provide a suite of training services that could be free of charge to support those sectors, make sure that they take the training that can help them out if they don't have the resources to have training, like a third-party vendor. Another interesting piece is the fact that 49% of those participating in the Florida Cyber Risk Assessment don't have a CISO, a Chief Information Security Officer. That information is very telling. So if you now are asking the sectors to do something, who's actually going to be doing that for them? What kind of workforce development tools and resources can we help them? What kind of knowledge services or third-party vendor support can we give them to ensure that they have someone on site to help them do all the things they need to do in this cascading world of cyber attacks? So the data that we collected from the risk assessment not only augmented our decision-making efforts, but also identify the gaps and the weaknesses that then the legislature could leverage to do what they just did, provide an incredible amount of money and resources to training. And at the same time, with Florida Digital Services, embarking on their policies and make sure that we do the things that we need to do from a maturity standpoint, is that we can also support their efforts with this, Florida Legislation 282, the code that's there to kind of help local municipalities adopt, a maturity model standard. Because of our data, we were able to get more resources to support their efforts by their findings because of the data we have collected. So we have great visibility to some of those things that just continue to help them make decisions and also help us be better about getting resources that can really support our public-private sector owners and operators.
Bryan, I think you mentioned that sectors are dealing with cascading cybersecurity incidents and events, and the assessment identified that many Florida CI sectors do not have the resources, funds, or staffing. What can be done to address this growing risk while supporting our community partners?
I think as we continue the risk assessment, we need to map resources to those who are completing the risk assessment. So if you have the assessment has, yes or no questions, we want you to be able to answer all yeses. But if you have a no, like for instance, a good one is a lot of sectors don't have an incident response plan. Therefore, USF, Cyber Florida, our SUS partners help create one that's now free. So now we can target resources based on the needs of those risk assessment findings for those sectors who just don't have the funds. And able to continue to do that, we continue to provide them resources, which then helps them with their maturity. And then they can go back to the risk assessment as they see fit. And then they can see how they matured, which is great because then you take that information, you give it to your general counsel, you give it to your risk insurance people, you give it to the CEO or the CFO to say, here are the incremental results that we're making. And James, to your point, we just see the aggregate. The information that you receive on completing the risk assessment report, you get 7 reports. That can kind of give you some benchmarking to your near and peers. That can also give you the opportunity to see what improvements you can make. And again, a lot of the information within the risk assessment could be applied based on the great resources that the state has, but they have to be mapped and they have to be connected. And that's just one thing that this risk assessment program, thanks to the state and thanks to others, is doing. So as opposed to saying, hey, complete this free risk assessment, well, what do you get in return? So if the state's asking you to mature your practices, to build up capacity, you can't do that unless you don't know what you're actually mapping to and what's available to you. And so our goal is the next evolution is to map and then to build maturity. So as you grow and as you increase, we can help you every step of the way because we've adopted NIST 2.0 and the state's looking at that as well. So because of your efforts and those who are listening, there's tangible evidence that we've drawn the fact that your investments are making significant impact on those under-resourced sectors. We just have to get the word out. We got to let people know these are free. We got to let people know that there's resources, that they're not alone, and that they can leverage Cyber Florida and connecting with their state agency partners, that we can all do this collector. So it's leveling, if you will, a consortium management. We're all kind of like a band of the hand coming together and supporting our sectors. And there's a lot of sectors out there. And so the more that we can engage, get in front of the public, get our policymakers to see the data that we have available to them, to help them out, because they're the ones who gave us the investment to do this in the first place. It's unbelievable. And again, no state or commonwealth is doing this because of the investments of the legislature. So now we can see all 16 sectors, and that's critical because, again, any cascading event can take down one sector to the other sector, and you lose your ability to make communications and informed decision-making if one sector is impacted over the other.
Couple thoughts, man. Most of the listeners here will know that I have friends and acquaintances in the legislature, so I'm not trying to make it a legislative infomercial, but really I think it's worth highlighting again how innovative the Florida legislature was in this approach and how ahead of the game we are compared to so many more states in the union,
I can tell you, if I may. So look, we did a lot of benchmarking. How did we got to these risk assessments? We worked with Idaho National Lab. It was kind of the think tank for CISA and DHS. And we've got great partnerships across the state and across the region. But when you benchmark with other states and commonwealths, and you look at the legislative impact and the number of bills going through the legislature, Florida is doing remarkably well in that area. We are now really taking that opportunity and leveraging it full tilt. So everything that's going on right now actually is coupled by and supported by the effort of which we are trying to do to support our sectors. And for more information is get out there and they should connect with the sectors, ask them how they're doing, and then make sure they always go back to say, hey, here's some resources that are available to you now. That's the biggest thing about government is making sure you have strong situational awareness to the resources that are out there to help people make an informed decision. And that's where we're very thankful for the legislature because we're doing it.
Yep. So you mentioned, we talked about the legislature's investment, talked about the great data, but you made a point. One of the findings was a lot of these critical infrastructure organizations don't have CISOs in place. So that talks about a problem that we face not only here in Florida, but nationwide, and that's the dearth of talent in this sector. Can you talk a little bit about how workforce development plays into closing these gaps?
Oh, it's significant. So we are working with a lot of our Florida cooperatives to identify ways to kind of look at the gaps and then kind of build opportunity to expand upon that. So that a couple examples of if you don't have entry-level workers, or if you don't have a senior manager who may not be strong in cybersecurity, the best thing that we can do is allocate tools and resources to support that sector to make informed decisions by giving them access to the Student Operations Center, by leveraging students at the junior community college, by working with USF or Cyber Florida to identify curriculum projects that can actually help students get to the next level in their technology pursuits. That's working with our SUS partners by leveraging all the workforce development tools and resources that exist. I mean, it's across the board, it's systemic. What makes Florida's efforts so unique is they're tethered. So you got a risk assessment that tells you your data and your trends and your gaps and your weaknesses. And then you align that to all the workforce development things that are out there. And either you leverage, the federal partners that we have or the state partners. But again, the biggest thing there with workforce development, that is across the board. Because again, with the technology and the leverage of sophistication for the cyber attackers that they have, everybody has to be stepped in. So that's why the training programs are so important, because everybody should be trained in cybersecurity. It's just the air we breathe. 90% of cyber attacks are done by human error, mis or disinformation. That's all about workforce development. We got to start creating a better avenue of getting more individuals. And that's why our K through 12 programs are so efficient and strong in Cyber Florida, because we're now looking at the younger generation, getting them involved in STEM and all the resources that are available to them. That's our young generational stuff. I'm always responding to a crisis. You got to mitigate, you got to make those investments. And the workforce development stuff that we're doing across the state, thanks to the DeSantis administration and others, we got to do more of that and invest more of it, because it's making big impact in the long term. In the long term is our near peer competitors, China and Russia. They're taking full advantage of some of the gaps that we have. If we get more people to fill those gaps, train those people on those gaps, and increase our situational awareness of the risks that's involved, then we can really counter back and create this as a national security threat that it is.
Yeah, this stuff gets me excited, and I tend to talk too much. I want to get Jordan back in, but one quick
I think
thought.
I've been talking a lot.
One quick thought, you talked about so much of what our partners have done. You touched on what Cyber Florida has done through supporting K-12 initiatives, the resources we put there, not just towards students to get K-12 students interested in STEM broadly, cyber specifically, but also to equip their teachers. But I thought it would also be worth mentioning some of the other avenues and actions that Cyber Florida has taken as a center to close this gap in working with the University of South Florida. We've, throughout our history, supported the establishment of multiple graduate level education programs to help fill this gap. We've secured federal grants to work on credential stacking for the non-traditional student to be able to get them the training they need to get into the workforce as fast as possible. We're leaving no stone unturned, even here at Cyber Florida, to do our part to address these gaps. Jordan, I'm going to throw it back over to you.
Yeah, of course. So Bryan, you mentioned the assessment, you mentioned all the great things about what it could do for critical infrastructure. We talked about training, workforce development, things like that. What does the program actively do right now to help critical infrastructure mitigate cyber attacks?
Currently, what we do right now is a team of teams approach. So we look at the fundamentals. We identify the risk and the gaps, and then we put resources, training, processes behind them. And then once we take that, we're focusing on mapping. That is a critical link that Florida is doing that's inherently unique. And I would say something that's going to be benchmarked across the nation. It's taking data and gaps and making sure that resources are being provided. That's what the CI sectors are asking for. That's what our customers need. They need access to resources. So let's give it to them. They can make an informed decision. And then once you take that information, now you start building up maturity. That's why we adopted this 2.0. So anything that's being done by the state and federal, we're already lock in step with what they're doing. So it's the mapping, it's the maturity, it's the resource allocation. But the biggest thing that we've got going for us too, besides good people that we work with, is our data. Our data is currency. Our data is king. Right now, we have over 8,000 to 10,000 critical infrastructure contacts that we can communicate with. So think about that when it comes to emergency management and preparedness to disasters. If you take all that information, add it into a blotter and overlay that, now you can see consequence and impacting those sectors. So that's incredible data not only we want to give to our state agency partners, but then at the time, we can take all that data and make policies. Like, for instance, we're developing a critical infrastructure intelligence report to look at the threats impacting. So we couldn't be here without taking this investment from the state, taking these risks, mapping, and putting resources in place. Now, that's not being done coherently because across the nation, everyone's focusing on a sector or so, and that's fine. But in Florida, we're looking at all 16 sectors. So that means that we have better interoperability and level to mitigating consequence management if we can work with all of them at the same time, so we can actually make sure that we can help each other if there's a crisis or a disaster.
Absolutely. So with that being said, looking to the future, how in the future will you plan to support all 16 sectors in Florida in addition to what you're doing now, maybe in terms of research and development, technology, AI? Those are all hot topics at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So all that kind of parts and parcel all comes together. So for instance, the data that we have that kind of give us informed decision-making intent builds R&D opportunities. So given the fact that we can see R&D opportunities across the space, that means that we can bring in more investments into our universities. We can identify opportunities to grow that with federal partners, get more federal grant funding in, or actually just better resources to our community partners that they can actually leverage. And at the same time, they can give us a level to create predictive analysis tools. You take that data, you see what the trends are, and you can overlay that by seeing what we expect in the future, which is great in decision-making decisions for emergency managers, for planning, training, exercise, response, and recovery procedures. That's a great way for forensics and law enforcement to see the current trends and where you need to shift funding or resources or people. So we're not always being step behind the situation. Then you take AI, which has been around since the 50s, and you leverage that to make sure that that information is getting to the right decision maker so he or she can see what's really happening in real time based on the information that we're collecting, but really based on the risks that we're seeing across the nation. That leverage of predictive analysis and also making key core investments. Let's say if we want to look at a future grant for USF to support our communities with, that grant could also be coupled by R&D and data to look at what kind of data we have and get those resources to those sectors as best as possible. So all that is interlaid with our future efforts, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so Bryan, this has been incredible and very insightful. We appreciate you being here. Before I pass it over to James to close us out, is there anything else that you wanted to mention or say about the program for our listeners?
Yeah, thank you very much. To couple with one thing is just like we are a resource. So the more that we can be available to you in terms of like knowing what's going on, what data we have, what the risks are, what the tools and resources that we're creating based with our partners, we want to make sure that people have visibility to it, help us be better, help us make more investments to our communities because there's a lot of need out there. But we're very, very thankful. And we continue to do this because of technology and the partnerships that we have. So no, thank you so much for your time. And sorry I spoke a lot.
No, this is great. This is what you're here for. So we appreciate it so much.
Thank you.
Another reason we were looking forward to having Bryan on is you can see the passion that he has for the program he runs. So Bryan, thank you again for coming on board. But before I get you out of here, we ask these technical questions. I have to ask one personal question. I was only kind of joking a little bit when I said I want to be Bryan when I grow up. So Bryan and I had a similar experience in our past careers, but him on a much grander scale. In a former life, I also spent a lot of time advancing a statewide elected. But you know what a fan I am of President Bush and that experience that you had there in your career. Do you have any cool stories you can share with us before we let you out of here of your time working in the Bush administration?
I tell you, very, very blessed to travel the world and support and do an advance for the president. It could be any president because it's an amazing experience. But I would say one of the funnier experiences was advancing Graceland with Edmund Agishima. Prime Minister Kwazume loved Elvis, and so we did an advance for a week in Graceland. And it was an unforgettable experience because I never received so much tchotchke or chum from Graceland. They give you all sorts of things that you can give out, and seeing this prime minister really get in the groove with the press ladies looking on and President Bush, staring at him going, wow, got the glasses on, they had barbecue. What that showed to me is how importantly relationships are with the chief executive officers. To see two world leaders have fun together, that was pretty cool.
That's awesome.
I can imagine. Such a cool experience. I could sit and listen to your stories for forever, but you know that. Bryan, thank you so much for coming on today. We really appreciate your time, man. We'll let you go.
Appreciate you all. Thank you.
Welcome to Cyber Florida's Shameless Plug with Jordan.
Well, that was a great conversation with Bryan talking about our critical infrastructure protection program. I would like to quickly highlight the other resources that Cyber Florida offers to Florida's public sector employees at no cost. So in addition to the critical infrastructure protection program, Cyber Florida offers education and training through our First Line program. This program provides no-cost cybersecurity training for state and local government employees at the executive, managerial, technical, and general staff levels. Cyber Florida has partnered with the University of South Florida, the University of West Florida, Florida International University, and the National White Collar Crime Center to offer courses that are presented as self-paced, scheduled online, and in person. Additionally, various courses are offered at locations throughout the state to minimize travel for participants. We are proud to say that the First Line program has reached all 67 counties in the state of Florida, meaning that we have participants from across the entire state who are actively working to make Florida's public sector workforce the most cyber ready in the nation. Listeners can find a complete list of courses through Cyber Florida's First Line program at cyberflorida.org. Moving on, I'll go right to our cyber range. Cyber Florida's Aligned Realistic Cyber Attack Simulation Range is a completely free virtual cyber training platform that hosts red versus blue exercises with live portrayals of hackers, providing invaluable network defense training for public sector technical employees throughout the state. We currently have 229 students on the range. That may have increased recently across 20 counties in Florida, and we are eager to host more. So just more additional training, And then lastly, Cyber Florida's CyberWorks fall and winter cohort is scheduled to begin on October 1st. The CyberWorks program is a 20-week virtual course that provides specialized training in areas such as network security, digital forensics, threat detection, and incident response. It is offered at no cost to Florida residents, thanks to support from a grant funded by the National Centers of Academic Excellence in Cybersecurity, and is designed for veterans, first responders, and career changers from historically underrepresented groups. Participants who successfully complete the course will receive vouchers to take the CompTIA Networking Plus and Security Plus exams. Check out cyberflorida.org to learn more about the program. I'm Jordan. That's my plug.
One shameless plug from me as well. We want to thank the audience. We're 4 or 5 episodes in right now. We appreciate you guys. Please do the usual, like and subscribe, tell a friend. We know it's a very niche audience, but we're doing this because we want to be a resource to you all, specifically the folks that are in the policymaking process, be that policymakers, staff, agency folks. We want to be a resource to you. So please, please, please let us do that. I of all people, know how long that drive to Tallahassee is, so I'll feel a little bit of the airwaves with listening to me hack on here. You can reach me, James W. Jacobs at usf.edu. If there's something we can do, something we can cover, some subject matter that would be useful to you that has to do with tech and cyber, please, please, please let us know.
All opinions expressed by the Chat Cyber podcast participants are their own and do not exclusively represent the views and opinions of Cyber Florida.